Hi, beautiful humans. Today we are going over Chapter 19 of A People's History of the United States, written by Howard Zinn. Chapter 19 is titled Surprises. We are going to see what happened after World War II. How the women responded to society saying, hey, you can work and you can hold us down while we're at war. But the moment they come back, the moment this war is over, you get back in the house. We're going to see what happened. We're going to hear about how women responded to that. We're going to learn about the movement towards abortion rights. And as always, the irony of the fact that we are living in 2024 and the things that we're going to cover here have now been repealed. The fact that we're going backwards is not lost on me. It's just time and time again throughout the experience of us going through this book. We are being brought to the present moment and being like, what the fuck? What the fuck is going on, right? We're also going to learn about how the United States was caught off guard by the movement initiated by the Native Americans to reclaim land, to demand rights, to have their treaties respected. And so, yeah, this is titled Surprises because a lot of this happened in a way that the government was not anticipating or expecting. However, as we will see, the United States government responded in ways that are to be expected. Surprise, surprise. Violence, repression, lying. Some of the favorite tactics used by leaders. So yeah, we're going to get into it. And y'all, we are almost at the end of this book. This is how much we've read, and this is how much we have left. That's crazy. There's only 26 chapters? 25? Let's see. 25. So we have 6 more chapters left. I already finished chapter 19, and I'm midway through chapter 20, so I'm hoping that I finish chapter 20 today, I record chapter 20 tomorrow, keep this going because we're almost there, and my book is officially less than 5 weeks away from being published. I need to finish this book before my book comes out, so let's get into it. In 1911, Emma Goldman said, "Our modern fetish is universal suffrage. After 1920, women were voting, as men did, and their subordinate condition had hardly changed." A writer in early 1930 boosting the beauty business started off a magazine article with the sentence, "The average American woman has 16 square feet of skin." He went on to say that there were 40,000 beauty shops in the country and that $2 billion was spent each year on cosmetics for women. But this was insufficient. American women are not yet spending even 1/5 of the amount necessary to improve their appearance. He then gave an itemized list of the annual beauty needs of every woman. 12 hot oil treatments, 52 facials, 26 eyebrow plucks, etc. World War II had brought more women than ever before out of the home and into work. By 1960, 36% of all women 16 and older, 23 million women, worked for paid wages. But although 43% of women with school-age children worked, there were nursery schools for only 2%. The rest had to work things out by themselves. Women were 50% of the voters, but they held 4% of the state legislative seats and 2% of the judgeships. The median income of the working woman was about 1/3 that of the man, and attitudes towards women did not seem to have changed much since the 20s. There is no overt anti-feminist in our society in 1964, wrote feminist and sociologist Alice Rossi, not because sex equality has been achieved, but because there is practically no feminist spark left among American women. In the civil rights movement of the 60s, the signs of a collective stirring began to appear. Women took the place they customarily took in social movements, in the front lines as privates, not generals. In the office of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee in Atlanta, a Spelman College student named Ruby Doris Smith, who had been jailed during the sit-ins, expressed her anger at the way women were relegated to the routine office work, and she was joined in her protest by 2 white women in SNCC, Sandra Hayden and Mary King. The men in SNCC listened to them respectfully, read the position paper they had put together asserting their rights, but did not do very much. Ella Baker, a veteran fighter from Harlem now organizing in the South, knew the pattern. I knew from the beginning that as a woman, an older woman in a group of ministers who were accustomed to having women largely as supporters, there was no place for me to have come into a leadership role. Nevertheless, women played a crucial role in those early dangerous years of organizing in the South, and were looked on with admiration. Many of these were older women like Ella Baker and Amelia Boynton in Selma, Alabama, and Mama Dolly in Albany, Georgia. Younger women like Gloria Richardson in Maryland and Nell Ponder in Mississippi were not only active, but leaders. Women of all ages demonstrated, went to jail. Mrs. Fannie Lou Hamer, a sharecropper in Ruleville, Mississippi, became legendary as an organizer and speaker. She sang hymns. She walked picket lines with her familiar limp. As a child, she contracted polio. She roused people to excitement at mass meetings. I'm sick and tired of being sick and tired. Around the same time, white, middle-class professional women were beginning to speak up. Betty Friedman wrote The Feminine Mystique. And in it said, just what was the problem that has no name? What were the words women used when they tried to express it? Sometimes a woman would say, I feel empty somehow, incomplete. Or she would say, I feel as if I don't exist. Sometimes a tired feeling. I get so angry with the children it scares me. I feel like crying without any reason. The mystique that Friedman spoke of was the image of the woman as mother, as wife, living through her husband, through her children, giving up on her own dreams for that. She concluded, the only way for a woman, as for a man, to find herself, to know herself as a person, is by creative work of her own. In the summer of 1964, in Macomb, Mississippi, at a Freedom House, a civil rights headquarters where people worked and lived together, the women went on strike against the men who wanted them to cook and make beds, while the men went around cars organizing. The stirring that Friedman spoke of was true of women everywhere, it seemed. By 1969, women were 40% of the entire labor force of the United States, but a substantial number of these were secretaries, cleaning women, elementary school teachers, saleswomen, waitresses, and nurses. 1 out of every 3 working women had a husband earning less than $5,000 a year. What of the women who did not have jobs? They worked very hard at home, but this wasn't looked on as work, because in a capitalist society, or perhaps in any modern society where things and people are bought and sold for money, if work is not paid for, not given a money value, it is considered valueless. Women began to think more about this fact in the 1960s, as Margaret Benston wrote about it in The Political Economy of Women's Liberation. Women doing housework were people outside the modern economic system. Therefore, they were like serfs or peasants, she said. In the fall of 1968, a group called Radical Women attracted national attention when they protested the selection of Miss America, which they called an image that oppresses women. They all threw bras, girdles, curlers, false eyelashes, wigs, and other things they called women's garbage into a freedom trash can. A sheep was crowned Miss America. More important, people were beginning to speak of women's liberation. This part took me out. Listen to this. Some of the New York radical women shortly after formed WITCH, Women's International Terrorist Conspiracy from Hell, and its members dressed as witches appeared suddenly on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange. A leaflet put out by Witch in New York said, "Witch lives and laughs in every woman. She is the free part of each of us, beneath the shy smiles, the acquiescence to absurd male domination. The makeup or flesh-suffocating clothes are sick society demands. There is no joining witch. If you are a woman and dare to look within yourself, you are a witch. You make your own rules." I love that. Witch in Washington, D.C. protested the United Fruit Company for the corporation's activities in the Third World and its treatment of its women office workers. In Chicago, it protested the firing of a radical feminist teacher named Marlene Dixon. We've been talking about pamphlets, right? There was a pamphlet that was put out by Patricia Robinson called Poor Black Women, in which she connected the problems of women with the need for basic social change. And I literally wrote here, must read it in series. She wrote, "Rebellion by poor Black women, the bottom of a class hierarchy heretofore not discussed, places the question of what kind of society will the poor Black woman demand and struggle for. Already she demands the right to have birth control, like middle-class Black and white women. She is aware that it takes two to oppress, and that she and other poor people no longer are submitting to oppression. In this case, genocide. She allies herself with the have-nots in the wider world and their revolutionary struggles. She had been forced by historical conditions to withdraw the children from male dominance and to educate and support them herself. In this very process, male authority and exploitation are seriously weakened. Further, she realizes that the children will be used all as poor children have been used throughout history, as poorly paid mercenaries. fighting to keep or put an elite group in power. Through these steps, she has begun to question aggressive male domination and the class society which enforces it, capitalism. In 1970, Dorothy Bolden, a laundry worker in Atlanta and mother of 6, told why in 1968 she began organizing women doing housework into National Domestic Workers Union. She said, "I think women should have a voice in making decisions in their community for betterment, because this woman in the slum is scuffling hard, and she's got a very good intelligent mind to do things, and she's been overlooked for so many years. I think she should have a voice." By the start of 1974, women's studies programs existed at 78 institutions, and about 2,000 courses on women were being offered at about 500 campuses. Women's magazines and newspapers began appearing locally and nationally, and books on women's history and the movement came out in such numbers that bookstores had special sections for them. In 1967, after lobbying by women's groups, President Johnson signed an executive order banning sex discrimination in federally connected employment, and in the years that followed, women's groups demanded that this be enforced. Over 1,000 suits were initiated by NOW, National Organization for Women, formed in 1966, against U.S. corporations charging sex discrimination. The right to abortion became a major issue. We're about to dive into the history of what the movement was like for women fighting for abortion access in the United States. It is not lost on me that we're going to dive into this now, and that throughout this entire time, from the 1970s to 2024, there have been people trying to undo the work that we are about to see right now. It says the right to abortion became a major issue. Before 1970, about 1 million abortions were done every year, of which only 10,000 were legal. Perhaps a third of the women having illegal abortions, mostly poor people, had to be hospitalized for complications. How many thousands died as a result of these illegal abortions, no one really knows. But the illegalization of abortion clearly worked against the poor, for the rich could manage either to have their baby or to have their abortion under safe conditions, which is literally what we're talking about right now. Court actions to do away with the laws against abortions were begun in over 20 states between 1968 and 1970, and public opinion grew stronger for the right of women to decide for themselves without government interference. In the book Sisterhood is Powerful, an important collection of women's writing around 1970, an article by Lucinda Sisler, Unfinished Business, Birth Control, said that abortion is a woman's right. No one can veto her decision and compel her to bear a child against her will. In the spring of 1969, a Harris poll showed that 64% of those polled thought the decision on abortion was a private matter. Finally, in early 1973, the Supreme Court decided, Roe v. Wade, Doe v. Bolton, that the state could prohibit abortions only in the last 3 months of pregnancy, that it could regulate abortion for health purposes during the second 3 months of pregnancy, and during the first 3 months, a woman and her doctor had the right to decide. There was a push for childcare centers, and although women did not succeed in getting much help from the government, thousands of cooperative childcare centers were set up. Women also began to speak openly for the first time about the problem of each year 50,000 were reported and many more were unreported. Women began taking self-defense courses. There were protests against the way police treated women, interrogated them, insulted them, and when women filed charges. Many women were active in trying to get a constitutional amendment, ERA, Equal Rights Amendment, passed by enough states, but it seems clear that even if it became law, it would not be enough, that what women had accomplished had come through organization, action, and protest. Even where the law was helpful, it was helpful only if backed by action. Perhaps the most profound effect of the women's movement of the 60s, beyond the actual victories on abortion and job equality, was called consciousness raising, often done in women's groups, which met in homes all across the country. This meant the rethinking of roles, the rejection of inferiority, the confidence in self, a bond of sisterhood, a new solidarity of mother and daughter. Wow. Consciousness raising. We need to bring that back. We need to bring that back. Quite frankly, I think a lot of it is already happening on TikTok. I have been thoroughly influenced by women on this app that I don't even know that are practically doing that. I think a lot of the conversations that women are having here on this platform is a virtual consciousness raising, but it also would be really interesting to know that this would be taking place in person in private settings where women can speak about things freely. For the first time, the sheer biological uniqueness of women was openly discussed. It was liberating to talk frankly about what had been, for so long, a secret. Hidden, cause for shame and embarrassment, menstruation, masturbation, menopause, abortion, lesbianism. The fight began, many women were saying, with the body, which seemed to be the beginning of the exploitation of women. As sex plaything, weak and incompetent. As pregnant women, helpless. As middle-aged women, no longer considered beautiful. As older women, to be ignored, set aside. A biological prison had been created by men and society. In her book Of Woman Born, Adrienne Rich said, "Women could use the body as a resource rather than a destiny. Patriarchal systems," she said, whether under capitalism or socialism, limited women's bodies to their own needs. She discussed the training of passivity in women. Generations of schoolgirls were raised on Little Women, where Jo is told by her mother, "I am angry nearly every day of my life, Jo, but I have learned not to show it, and I still hope to learn not to feel it, though it may take me another 40 years to do so." Male doctors use instruments to bring out children, replacing the sensitive hands of midwives in the era of anesthetized, technologicized childbirth. Rich disagreed with her fellow feminist Firestone, who wanted to change the biological inevitability of childbirth because it was painful and a source of subordination. She wanted, under different social conditions, to make childbirth a source of physical and emotional joy. In the problem of women was the germ of a solution, not only for their oppression, but for everybody's. The control of women in society was ingeniously effective. It was not done directly by the state. Instead, the family was used, men to control women, women to control children, all to be preoccupied with one another, to turn to one another for help, to blame one another for trouble, to do violence unto one another when things weren't going right. Why could this not be turned around? Could women liberating themselves, children freeing themselves, men and women beginning to understand one another, find the source of their common oppression outside rather than in one another? Perhaps then they could create nuggets of strength in their own relationships, millions of pockets of insurrection. They could revolutionize thought and behavior in exactly that seclusion of family privacy which the system had counted on to do its work of control and indoctrination. Are you processing this? And together, instead of at odds, male, female, parents, children, they could undertake the changing of society itself. The prison had arisen in the United States as an attempt at Quaker reform to replace mutilation, hanging, exile, the traditional punishments during colonial times. The prison was intended, through isolation, to produce repentance and salvation. But prisoners went insane and died in that isolation. The approach was summed up by the warden at the Ossining, New York penitentiary. In order to reform a criminal, you must first break his spirit. That approach persisted. Oh my fucking goodness, bro. There had always been prison riots. A wave of them in the 1920s ended with a riot at Clinton, New York, a prison of 1,600 inmates, which was suppressed with 3 prisoners killed. Between 1950 and 1953, more than 50 major riots occurred in American prisons. In the early 1960s, prisoners on a work gang in Georgia smashing rocks used the same sledgehammers to break their legs to call attention to their situation of daily brutality. In November 1970, in Folsom Prison in California, a work stoppage began, which became the longest prison strike in the history of the United States. Most of the 2,400 prisoners held out in their cells for 19 days without food in the face of threats and intimidation. The strike was broken with a combination of force and deception, and 4 of the prisoners were sent on a 14-hour ride to another prison, shackled and naked on the floor of the fucking van. One of the rebels wrote, "The spirit of awareness has grown. The seed has been planted." The prisons in the United States had long been an extreme reflection of the American system itself. The stark life differences between rich and poor, the racism, the use of victims against one another, the lack of resources and the underclass to speak out, the endless reforms that changed little. Dostoevsky once said, "The degree of civilization in a society can be judged by entering its prisons." It had long been true, and prisoners knew this better than anyone, that the poorer you were, the more likely you were to end up in jail. This was not just because the poor committed more crimes. In fact, they did. The rich did not have to commit crimes to get what they wanted. The laws were on their side. But when the rich did commit crimes, they often were not prosecuted. And if they were, they could get out on bail. Hire clever lawyers, get better treatment from judges. Somehow, the jails ended up full of poor Black people. With such power in the hands of the courts, the poor, the black, the odd, the homosexual, the hippie, the radical are not likely to get equal treatment before judges who are almost uniformly white, upper-class, orthodox. The prison rebellions of the late 60s and early 70s had a distinctly different character than the earlier ones. The prisoners in the Queen's House of Detention referred to themselves as revolutionaries. All over the country, prisoners were obviously affected by the turmoil in the country, the Black Revolt, the youth upsurge, and the anti-war movement. The events of those years underlined what prisoners already sensed, that whatever crimes they had committed, the greatest crimes were being committed by the authorities who maintained the prisons, by the government of the United States. The law was being broken daily by the president, sending bombers to kill, sending men to be killed outside the Constitution, outside the highest law of the land. State and local officials were violating the civil rights of Black people, which was against the law, and were not being prosecuted for it. Literature about the Black movement, books on the war, began to seep into the prisons. The example set in the streets by Blacks, by anti-war demonstrators, was exhilarating. Against a lawless system, defiance was the only answer. There had always been political prisoners, people sent to jail for belonging to radical movements, for opposing war. But now, a new kind of political prisoner appeared, the man or woman convicted of an ordinary crime who in prison became awakened politically. Some prisoners began making connections between their personal ordeal and the social system. They turned not to individual rebellion, but to collective action. They became concerned amid an environment whose brutality demanded concentration of one's own safety, an atmosphere of cruel rivalry for the rights, the safety of others. George Jackson, one of these new political prisoners, in Soledad Prison, California, on an indeterminate sentence for a $70 robbery. Having already served 10 years of it, Jackson became a revolutionary. He spoke with a fury that matched his condition. This monster, the monster they've engendered in me, will return to torment its maker. From the grave, the pit, the profoundest pit. Hurl me into the next existence. The descent into hell won't turn me. I'm going to charge them reparations in blood. I'm going to charge them like a maddened, wounded, rogue male elephant. Ears flared, trunk raised, trumpet blaring. War without terms. A prisoner like this would not last. And when his book, Soledad Brother, became one of the most widely read books of Black militancy in the United States, by prisoners, by Black people, by white people, perhaps this ensured he would not last. He knew what might happen. Born to a premature death, a menial, subsistence wage worker, odd job man, the cleaner, the caught, the man under hatches, without bail. That's me, the colonial victim. Anyone who can pass the civil service examination today can kill me tomorrow, with complete immunity. In August 1971, he was shot in the back by guards at San Quentin Prison while he was allegedly trying to escape. The state's story was full of holes. Prisoners in jails and state prisons all over the country knew, even before the final autopsy was in, even before later disclosures suggested a government plot to kill Jackson, that he had been murdered for daring to be a revolutionary in prison. Shortly after Jackson's death, there was a chain of rebellions around the country, in San Jose Civic Center Jail, in Dallas County Jail, in Suffolk County Jail in Boston, in Cumberland County Jail in Bridgeton, New Jersey, in Bexar County Jail in San Antonio, Texas. The most direct effect of the George Jackson murder was the rebellion at Attica Prison in 1971, a rebellion that came from long, deep grievances, but that was raised to boiling point by the news about George Jackson. Okay, let's talk about the rebellion that happened at the Attica prison in September 1971. Attica was surrounded by a 30-foot wall, 2 feet thick, with 14 gun towers. 54% of the inmates were Black. 100% of the guards were white. Prisoners spent 14 to 16 hours a day in their cells. Their mail was read. Their reading material restricted. Their visits from families conducted through a mesh screen. Their medical care disgraceful. Their parole system inequitable. Racism everywhere. How perceptive the prison administration was about these conditions can be measured by the comment of the superintendent of Attica, Vincent Mancusi, when the uprising began. "Why are they destroying their home?" he said. Most of the Attica prisoners were there as a result of plea bargaining. In plea bargaining, the accused pleads guilty, whether he is or not, and saves the state the trouble of a trial in return for the promise of a less severe punishment. When Attica prisoners were up for parole, the average time of their hearing, including the reading of the file and deliberation among 3 members, was 5.9 minutes. Then, the decision was handed out with no explanation. On September 9, 1971, a series of conflicts between prisoners and guards ended with a group of inmates breaking through a gate with a defective weld and taking over one of the 4 prison yards, with 40 guards as hostages. Then followed 5 days in which the prisoners set up a remarkable community in the yard. A group of citizen observers invited by the prisoners included New York Times columnist Tom Wicker wrote, "The racial harmony that prevailed among the prisoners, it was absolutely astonishing. That prison yard was the first place I have ever seen where there was no racism." One black prisoner later said, "I never thought whites could really get it on, but I can't tell you what the yard was like. I actually cried. It was so close, everyone so together." After 5 days, the state lost patience. Governor Nelson Rockefeller approved a military attack on the prison. National Guardsmen, prison guards, the local police went in with automatic rifles, carbines, and submachine guns in full-scale assault on the prisoners who had no firearms. The first stories given the press by prison authorities said that 9 guards held hostage had their throats slashed by the prisoners during the attack. The official autopsies almost immediately showed this to be false. The 9 guards died in the same hail of bullets that killed the prisoners. The effects of Attica are hard to measure. 2 months after the revolt at Attica, men in Norfolk Prison in Massachusetts began to organize. What was happening was the organization of prisoners, the caring of prisoners for one another, the attempt to take the hatred and anger of individual rebellion and turn it into collective effort for change. On the outside, something new was also happening: the development of prison support groups all over the country, the building of a body of literature about prisons. There were more studies of crime and punishment, a growing movement for the abolition of prisons on the grounds that they did not prevent crime or cure it, but expanded it. For a long time, people have known that the prison system is absolutely horrid. Horrid. It is a hellscape. It stems from the Quakers' approach to salvation. And clearly, that shit's not working, because you can't just throw people in cells and expect them to change. You have to look at the entire ecosystem of society. We need to help people. We need to actually help people. We need to reestablish care in society. But yeah, people have been asking for prison reform and have been calling for the abolition of prisons since the 70s. So anytime that somebody tries to make you feel like this is too radical and too new of a concept, just know that this has been around. People have been trying to talk about this for 50 years. As prison support groups popped up all around the country and people began demanding for the abolition of prisons and began to imagine what we could implement instead of the Quaker version of punishment and, salvation, which is what the modern day prison system was born from, alternatives were discussed. Community houses in the short run, guaranteed minimum economic security in the long run. The prisoners were thinking about the issues beyond prison, victims other than themselves and their friends. In Walpole Prison, a statement asking for American withdrawal from Vietnam was circulated. It was signed by every single prisoner, an amazing organizing feat by a handful of inmates. One Thanksgiving there, most of the prisoners, not only in Walpole, but in 3 other prisons, refused to eat the special holiday meal, saying that they wanted to bring attention to the hungry all over the United States. In 1978, the Supreme Court ruled that the news media do not have guaranteed rights of access to jails and prisons. It ruled also that prison authorities could forbid inmates to speak to one another, assemble, or spread literature about the formation of a prisoners' union. It became clear, and prisoners seemed to know this from the start, that their condition would not be changed by law, but by protest, organization, resistance, the creation of their own culture, their own literature, the building of links with people on the outside. There were more outsiders now who knew about prisons. Tens of thousands of Americans had spent time behind bars in the civil rights and anti-war movements. They had learned about the prison system and could hardly forget their experiences. There was a basis now for breaking through the long isolation of the prisoners from the community and finding support there. In the mid-70s, this was beginning to happen. It was a time of upsurge. Women, guarded in their very homes, rebelled. Prisoners, put out of sight and behind bars, rebelled. The greatest surprise was still to come. It says here, the Indian tribes attacked, subdued, starved out, had been divided up by putting them on reservations where they lived in poverty. In 1887, an Allotment Act tried to break up reservations into small plots of land owned by individual Indians to turn them into American-type small farmers, but much of this land was taken by white speculators and the reservations remained. Then, during the New Deal, with a friend of the Indians, John Collier, in charge of the Bureau of Indian Affairs, there was an attempt to restore tribal life. But in the decades that followed, no fundamental change took place. Many Indians stayed on the impoverished reservations. The younger ones often left. An Indian anthropologist said, "An Indian reservation is the most complete colonial system in the world that I know about." As the civil rights and anti-war movements developed in the 1960s, Indians were already gathering their energy for resistance, thinking about how to change their situation, beginning to organize. In 1961, 500 tribal and urban Indian leaders met in Chicago. Out of this came another gathering of university-educated young Indians who formed the National Indian Youth Council. Around this time, Indians began to approach the United States government on an embarrassing topic, treaties. In his widely read 1969 book, Custer Died for Your Sins, Vine Deloria Jr. noted that President Lyndon Johnson talked about America's commitments and President Nixon talked about Russia's failure to respect treaties. He said Indian people laugh themselves sick when they hear these statements. The United States government had signed more than 400 treaties with Indians and violated every single one. For instance, back in George Washington's administration, a treaty was signed with the Iroquois of New York. The United States acknowledged all the land within the aforementioned boundaries to be the property of the Seneca Nation. But in the early 60s, under President Kennedy, the United States ignored the treaty and built a dam on this land, flooding most of the Seneca Reservation. Resistance was already taking shape in various parts of the country. In the state of Washington, there was an old treaty taking land from the Indians, but leaving them fishing rights. This became unpopular as the white population grew and wanted the fishing areas exclusively for themselves. When the state courts closed river areas to Indian fishermen, in 1964, Indians had fish-ins on the Nisqually River in defiance of the court orders and went to jail, hoping to publicize their protest. A local judge the following year ruled that the Puyallup tribe did not exist, and its members could not fish on the river named for them, the Puyallup River. Policemen raided Indian fishing groups, destroyed boats, slashed nets, manhandled people, arrested 7 Indians. A Supreme Court ruling in 1968 confirmed Indian rights under the treaty, but said a state could regulate all fishing if it did not discriminate against Indians. Some of the Indians involved in the fish-ins were veterans of the Vietnam War. In 1969, November 9th, there took place a dramatic event which focused attention on Indian grievances as nothing else had. It burst through the invisibility of previous local Indian protests and declared to the entire world that Indians still lived and would fight for their rights. On November 9th, 1969, before dawn, 78 Indians landed on Alcatraz Island in San Francisco Bay and occupied the island. Alcatraz was an abandoned federal prison, a hated and terrible place nicknamed The Rock. In 1964, some young Indians had occupied it to establish an Indian university, but they were driven off and there was no publicity. This time was different. The group was led by Richard Oakes, a Mohawk who directed Indian studies at San Francisco State College, and Grace Thorpe, a Sauk and Fox Indian, daughter of Jim Thorpe, the famous Indian college football star and Olympic runner, jumper, hurdler. More Indians landed, and by the end of November, nearly 600 of them, representing more than 50 tribes, were living on Alcatraz. They called themselves Indians of all tribes and issued a proclamation. "We hold the rock." In it, they offered to buy Alcatraz in glass beads and red cloth, the price paid Indians for Manhattan Island over 300 years earlier. They announced they would make the island a center for Native American studies for ecology. "We will work to depollute the air and the waters of the Bay Area, restore fish and animal life." 6 months later, federal forces invaded the island and physically removed Indians living there. Indians who had been in the Vietnam War made connections. At the Winter Soldier investigations in Detroit, where Vietnam veterans testified about their experiences, an Oklahoma Indian named Evan Haney told about this. "The same massacres happened to the Indians 100 years ago. Germ warfare was used then. They put smallpox in the Indians as blankets. I got to know the Vietnamese people, and I learned that they were just like us. What we are doing is destroying ourselves and the world. I have grown up with racism all my life. When I was a child, watching cowboys and Indians on TV, I would root for the cavalry, not the Indians. It was that bad. I was that far toward my own destruction. Though 50% of the children at the country school I attended in Oklahoma were Indians, nothing in school, on television, or or on the radio taught anything about Indian culture. There were no books on Indian history, not even in the library. But I knew something was wrong. I started reading and learning my own culture. I saw the Indian people at their happiest when they went to Alcatraz or to Washington to defend their fishing rights. They at last felt like human beings. Indians began to do something about their own destruction, the annihilation of their culture. In 1969, at the first convocation of American Indian scholars, Indians spoke indignantly of either the ignoring or the insulting of Indians in textbooks given to little children all over the United States. That year, the Indian Historian Press was founded. It evaluated 400 textbooks in elementary and secondary schools and found that not one of them gave an accurate depiction of the Indian. Okay, this is the final video for chapter 19. In the 1970s, 54% of the adult males on the Pine Ridge Reservation were unemployed. 1/3 of the families were on welfare or pensions. Alcoholism was widespread, and suicide rates were high. The life expectancy of an Oglala Sioux was 46 years. On February 27, 1973, about 300 Oglala Sioux, many of them members of the new militant organization called the American Indian Movement, entered the village of Wounded Knee and declared it liberated territory. Ellen Moove's camp later said, "We decided that we did not need the American Indian Movement in here because our men were scared. They hung to the back. It was mostly the women that went forward and spoke out." Within hours, more than 200 FBI agents, federal marshals, and police of the Bureau of Indian Affairs surrounded and blockaded the town. They had armored vehicles, automatic rifles, machine guns, grenade launchers, and gas shells, and soon began firing. Gladys Bissonnette said 3 weeks later, "Since we are here in Wounded Knee, we've been shot at over and over, always after dark. But last night we were hit the hardest. I guess the Great Spirit is with us, but no bullets find their way into our bodies. We ran through a hail of bullets one night. We are going to hold our stand until we are completely an independent sovereign nation, Oglala Sioux Nation." After the siege began, food supplies became short. Indians in Michigan sent food via a plane that landed inside the encampment. The next day, FBI agents arrested the pilot and a doctor from Michigan who had hired the plane. In Nevada, 11 Indians were arrested for taking food, clothing, and medical supplies to South Dakota. In mid-April, there were planes dropped, 1,200 pounds of food, but as people scrambled to gather it up, a government helicopter appeared overhead and fired down on them while ground fire came from all sides. Frank Clearwater, an Indian man lying on a cot inside a church, was hit by a bullet. When his wife accompanied him to a hospital, she was arrested and jailed. Clearwater died. In the 60s and 70s, it was not just a women's movement, a prisoners' movement, an Indian movement. There was general revolt against oppressive, artificial, previously unquestioned ways of living. It touched every aspect of personal life: childbirth, childhood, love, sex, marriage, dress, music, art, sports, language, food, housing, religion, literature, death, schools. The new temper, the new behavior shocked many Americans. It created tensions. Sometimes it was seen as a generation gap, the younger generation moving far away from the older one in its way of life. But it seemed after a while not to be so much a matter of age. Some young people remained straight, while some middle-aged people were changing their ways, and old people were beginning to behave in ways that astounded others. Sexual behavior went through startling changes. Premarital sex was no longer a matter for silence. Men and women lived together outside of marriage and struggled for words to describe the other person when introduced. Married couples candidly spoke of their affairs, and books appeared discussing open marriage. There was a new suspicion of big business, of profiteering as the motive for ruining the environment. There was a re-examination of the death industry, of money-making funerals and profitable tombstones, as in Jessica Mitford's The American Way of Death. With the loss of faith in big powers, business, government, religion, there arose a stronger belief in self, whether individual or collective. The experts in all fields were now looked at skeptically. The belief grew that people could figure out for themselves what to eat, how to live their lives, how to be healthy. There was suspicion of the medical industry and campaigns against chemical preservatives, valueless foods, advertising. By now, the scientific evidence of the evils of smoking, cancer, heart disease was so powerful that the government barred advertising of cigarettes on television and newspapers. Traditional education began to be re-examined. The schools had taught whole generations of values of patriotism, of obeying authority, and had perpetuated ignorance, even contempt for people of other nations, races, Native Americans, women. Not just the content of education was challenged, but the style, the formality, the bureaucracy, the insistence on subordination to authority. This made only a small dent in the formidable national system of orthodox education, but it was reflected in a new generation of teachers all over the country. Never in American history had more movements for change been concentrated in so short a span of years, but the system in the course of 2 centuries had learned a good deal about the control of people. In the mid-70s, it went to work. That is the end of chapter 19. The next chapter is chapter 20, and it is titled The 70s Under Control. Every single chapter, we are 539 pages into this book. Every single chapter, at the end, I say, the more things change, the more they stay the same. The last few paragraphs that I just read could have been written today. All of this, the loss of faith in big powers, businesses, government, people challenging the medical system, the food that we eat, advertising, all of that could be written today. Prison reform, people, what they were saying in the early 70s, that's what people are saying now. I don't know, man. How does this make you feel? I keep saying I feel like I'm going a little bit crazy, but like, do you feel crazy? Because I feel like I keep going in circles reading this book because I'm like going back and forth. I'm like jumping timelines. I'm like, oh, going back to this one, coming to the present, and like literally only time has passed. All right, I'm going to edit these videos, finish reading chapter 20, and go drink some water. As always, thank you for being here. Thank you for learning. Thank you for leaning in. And I hope that this was helpful.